If you stand at the edge of the 1,930 seconds and let the silence settle around you, you begin to understand how utterly the world had changed. The exuberance of the roaring 20s had evaporated, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Those who had danced beneath the glittering lights of jazz clubs now found themselves wandering through streets lined with shuttered factories, boarded windows, and the weary eyes of men looking for work that no longer existed. The Great Depression was not merely an economic collapse, it was a psychological rupture, a moment when the American spirit, once so certain of its destiny, was forced to confront the fragility of its own foundation. To study this era is to witness humanity wrestling with forces so vast, so invisible, that even seasoned financiers and presidents struggled to articulate what had gone wrong. The crash of 1929 may have been the spark, but it was not the fire. What followed was a slow, suffocating tightening of the financial lungs. Banks failed by the thousands. Farms were foreclosed. International trade collapsed. Prices plunged in a deflationary spiral so severe it seemed to defy economic law. I often imagine standing inside a small-town bank in 1931, watching depositors crowd the lobby, panic etched across their faces. They had come not for profits but for survival, for the assurance that the money they had entrusted to this institution still existed. And when the teller quietly announced that the bank had closed its doors, the silence that followed carried the weight of an entire era folding in on itself. Bank failures were not just financial events. They were psychological earthquakes. A bank is, after all, nothing more than a structure built on confidence. And when that confidence breaks, no architecture can hold. Families lost life savings that had taken decades to accumulate. Businesses that depended on credit found themselves stranded, incapable of paying workers or suppliers. Deflation, brutal, merciless, made every dollar more valuable, but every debt more crushing. Imagine owing $1,000 when wheat costs half what it did the year before. What feels like cheap goods becomes a noose tightening around your livelihood. Deflation is not a symptom of inactivity. It is a symptom of despair. Internationally, the crisis spread like a plague, carried not through human contact, but through the delicate mechanisms of global finance. Countries clinging to the gold standard found themselves trapped by its rigid discipline. Britain abandoned gold in 1931. The United States clung to it until 1933, absorbing unnecessary pain in the process. Germany descended deeper into political extremism as unemployment soared. Nations raised tariffs in desperation, each hoping to protect its own industries, but simultaneously choking the arteries of global trade. The world retreated, fractured, and turned inward. It was as if nations, like individuals, believed that isolation might save them, when in fact, isolation guaranteed their suffering. At the center of the American crisis stood President Herbert Hoover, a man of intellect, compassion, and engineering brilliance, yet tragically misaligned with the psychological needs of the era. Hoover believed in voluntary cooperation, in restraint, in the dignity of self-reliance. These ideals had served him well in earlier years, particularly in humanitarian efforts abroad. But the Depression was not a crisis that yielded to moral appeals. It was a systemic breakdown, a collapse of trust so total that only bold, coordinated intervention could arrest the downward spiral. Hoover feared government overreach. The public feared starvation. The gap between these fears widened month by month. By 1932, despair had become a national condition. 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed. Soup kitchens stretched across city blocks. Men rode freight trains across states searching for work. The Dust Bowl compounded the misery, turning fertile plains into wasteland and driving thousands of families westward in search of a future no one could promise. Cities built makeshift settlements, Hoovervilles, where the unemployed slept beneath newspapers and scrap wood. It was a portrait of a nation stripped to its bones, forced to reckon with the illusion that markets, left alone, could always self-correct. Yet, even in this darkness, something remarkable began to stir. The realization that the Depression was not a punishment for human failure, but a failure of economic design. Prices, wages, production, banking, trade, all had collapsed not because people had lost their will to work, but because the system had lost its ability to translate work into opportunity. When everything contracts at once, individual effort becomes meaningless. It is here that the deeper lesson of the Great Depression begins to emerge. Stability is not the natural state of capitalism. Stability must be engineered, maintained, defended. The arrival of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933 felt less like a political transition and more like a shift in climate. FDR understood the psychic dimension of the crisis, the need for hope, clarity, direction. His voice, carried through radio waves in fireside chats, became a bridge between government and the people, a gentle reassurance that the chaos could be harnessed. But beyond the rhetoric came action, sweeping reforms aimed at reweaving the torn fabric of American finance. The Banking Act stabilized deposits. The SEC imposed discipline on Wall Street. Public works programs injected life into communities gasping for employment. Social Security planted the seeds of long-term security. The government was no longer a spectator. It had become a steward. The Depression did not end with these reforms. They alleviated suffering, restored confidence, and rebuilt the institutional scaffolding of the economy. But the deeper global malaise persisted. Recovery would arrive only with the onset of World War II, when full employment and massive industrial mobilization revived production. Yet, it is a mistake to conclude that the New Deal failed. Its true legacy was not immediate prosperity, but the construction of an economic architecture strong enough to prevent another collapse of comparable scale. Deposit insurance, labor protections, financial oversight, unemployment support, these created buffers that transformed capitalism from a dangerous roller coaster into something steadier, more humane. But the greatest lesson of the Great Depression is one that transcends policy. It is the recognition that economies are not machines, they are ecosystems of trust. When trust breaks, collapse follows. When trust is restored, recovery begins. The 1,920 seconds taught America how quickly euphoria can outrun reality. The 1,930 seconds taught America how deeply that euphoria, when shattered, can wound the human spirit. And together they taught the world that no boom is permanent, no system self-stabilizing, and no society immune to the consequences of unchecked speculation. The Depression is not a relic. It is a warning etched into the architecture of modern finance, a reminder that prosperity requires vigilance, humility, and the courage to intervene when the foundations tremble. Because every economic system carries within it the seeds of its own instability. And the true test of leadership lies not in preventing crises altogether, they cannot be prevented, but in recognizing when a crisis is forming and having the conviction to act before the world slides once again into the abyss. A conviction that would soon become essential as the next chapters of the century edged closer, bringing with them burdens, revelations, and unresolved tensions that would shape not only the remainder of the 20th century, but the very philosophy of economic governance itself. For as the world stepped out of the pit of the Great Depression, it did so carrying a new awareness and understanding that the old laissez-faire doctrines had proven too brittle for the demands of a modern, interconnected economy, that markets left entirely to their own devices could drift into euphoria and then collapse under the weight of their own illusions, and that governments, whether they wished to or not, were now permanent actors in the drama of capitalism. The Depression had changed not just policy, it had changed the psychology of nations. The United States emerged from the crisis not simply with new laws, but with a fundamentally new economic identity. The New Deal had redefined the relationship between state and citizen. Banks could no longer gamble with deposits. Corporations had to answer to regulators. Workers had rights backed by federal authority. And for the first time, the government accepted responsibility for stabilizing the economy, managing demand, supporting employment, ensuring a safety net beneath the most vulnerable. These were profound shifts, and they lingered even as recovery remained incomplete. The Depression had taught America that capitalism without guardrails was not freedom, it was fragility. But while the U.S. built an architecture of stability, Europe wrestled with consequences far more volatile. Germany, shattered first by hyperinflation and then by mass unemployment, drifted toward extremism. The Depression provided the perfect psychological fuel for the rise of Hitler fear, resentment, humiliation, and the desperate longing for order. Italy, already under Mussolini, tightened its fascist grip. Japan expanded its military ambitions, seeking economic security through conquest. Britain and France, weakened by debt and political paralysis, struggled to respond. In every corner of the world, the Depression revealed a truth older than finance itself. Prolonged economic despair becomes political dynamite. International cooperation, already fragile after World War I, collapsed almost entirely. Nations raised tariffs, devalued currencies, and retreated into protectionism. The global economy fractured into rival blocs. Trade, once the lifeblood of prosperity, shrank by 2/3. Central banks acted defensively instead of collaboratively. It was as if the world, having been burned by interdependence, now sought refuge in isolation. But isolation proved no shield. Economic nationalism inflamed tensions, hardened ideologies, and removed the incentives for compromise. In this way, the Depression was not only a financial crisis, it was a prelude, a dark overture to the larger conflict the world was stumbling toward. Yet even amid the geopolitical unraveling, intellectual revolutions were taking shape. John Maynard Keynes, observing the failures of austerity and deflation, articulated a new framework. Economies could stall not because of laziness or inefficiency, but because total demand fell short of total supply. Governments, he argued, must act counter-cyclically, spending when the private sector retreats, stimulating when investment dries up. It was a radical proposition at the time, but the Depression provided the laboratory of proof. Keynesian thought would soon reshape global policy, especially after World War II, becoming the blueprint for the mid-century economic order. Meanwhile, ordinary people, those who had endured the breadlines, the foreclosures, the silent mornings searching for work, carried their own set of lessons. They learned thrift. They learned suspicion. They learned that prosperity could vanish overnight. The generation that survived the Depression became profoundly different from the generation that had danced through the Jazz Age. Their caution shaped consumer habits. Their trauma shaped politics. Their resilience shaped the post-war boom. It is no exaggeration to say that the Depression carved itself into the American psyche with the permanence of a scar, and then came the war. World War II did what the New Deal could not fully accomplish. It ended the Depression by mobilizing the economy on a scale unprecedented in human history. Factories roared to life. Unemployment vanished. Women entered the workforce in transformative numbers. Government spending exploded, but now in service of survival, not relief. When victory arrived in 1945, the U.S. emerged with unmatched industrial capacity, enormous financial power, and a conviction that economic chaos could never again be allowed to threaten global stability. The Depression had taught the world that unmanaged capitalism bred catastrophe. The war taught it that coordinated capitalism could be a foundation for peace. And so, as nations gathered at Bretton Woods in 1944, they designed a new global order, one intended to prevent both the financial chaos of the 1,930 seconds and the geopolitical chaos of the 1,940 seconds. Exchange rates stabilized, international institutions emerged, collaboration replaced isolation. The world had learned, painfully, that prosperity required structure, communication, and shared responsibility. But even as the Depression faded into memory, its lessons lingered like a quiet undertow beneath the surface of modern finance. Every boom carried reminders of 1,929. Every recession provoked fears of 1,931. Every financial innovation raised questions about risk, leverage, and oversight. It is remarkable how often policymakers, confronted with new crises, invoke the Great Depression as a warning, a compass, a shadow guiding their decisions. The 2008 financial crisis, for instance, was met with aggressive monetary and fiscal intervention, precisely because leaders understood what hesitation had cost in the early 1,930 seconds. The Depression had become not only an event, but a doctrine. The doctrine that in the face of systemic collapse, bold action is not optional, it is necessary. And this, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of all. Economic stability is not passive. It must be engineered, defended, and continually reimagined. The Great Depression showed that capitalism is capable of extraordinary growth and extraordinary destruction, that markets can build empires or bring them to their knees, and that the line between prosperity and collapse is far thinner than societies like to believe. But it also showed that resilience is possible, that institutions can evolve, policies can adapt, and nations can rebuild even after the harshest winter. When I look back at the 1,930 seconds, I do not see only despair. I see the blueprint for modern economic governance. I see the birth of safety nets, regulations, countercyclical policy, and the international frameworks that still shape our world today. The Depression was a wound, yes, but it was also a teacher, one whose lessons echo through every financial crisis since. If this journey through the darkest decade of modern finance stirred something in you, if a moment, idea, or image suddenly felt alive, share what resonated most. And if you like more cinematic explorations of how financial upheavals sculpt our present, follow the channel so you never miss the next story.